Welcome to Music History Monday for May 13th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's post is, What Day is Today? If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. We recognize May 13th as being, among other days here in the United States, National Frog Jumping Day, Leprechaun Day, International Hummus Day, National Crouton Day, and, wait for it, World Cocktail Day. National days, weeks, and months. Who creates these damned things? We'll get to that in just a moment, but first, let's distinguish between a national holiday and a national day, or week, or month. In the United States, national or federal holidays are designated by Congress and/or the President. There are presently a total of 10 national/federal holidays, meaning that federal employees get to take the day off. However, anyone can declare a national day, or week, or month. The trick is getting enough people to buy into the day that it actually gains some traction and has some meaning. Such national days are created by advocacy groups, lobbying groups, industry groups, governmental bodies, even individuals. According to the National Day Calendar, today, May 13th, 2024, is, along with those days listed at the top of this post, National Women's Checkup Day, National Fruit Cocktail Day, and National Apple Pie Day. May 13th of this year is also the first day of Bike to Work Week, of Dementia Awareness Week, Water Savings Week, American Craft Beer Week, National Salvation Army Week, National Stationery Week, and National Smile Month. I am oh so tempted to call this list of promotional idiocy, well, idiocy. But that today is both World Cocktail Day and the first day of American Craft Beer Week has gratefully given us the hook for both today's Music History Monday post and tomorrow's Dr. Bob Prescribes post. The drinking habits of some of our favorite composers and drinking songs we should all know and love. A disclaimer and a necessary preemptive point. First, the disclaimer. While I like my dry gin martinis as much as the next guy, hell, I probably like them a lot more than the next guy, I am in no way promoting the consumption of alcohol in this post, especially in excess. Rather, as is my usual MO, my goal is to render as human as I can composers who are otherwise pedestalized and, as such, dehumanized. And now, the necessary point. Today, some of us tend to be very judgmental about the regular consumption of alcohol. And no wonder, given its potentially addictive nature and sometimes adverse effects on our bodies, moods, and minds, it is, for many people, nothing less than poison. But for most of us, it is a great pleasure in a life otherwise in short supply of such. Now please, in the centuries prior to the 20th, alcoholic beverages were more than merely recreational fluids, but lifesavers as well, as the dearth of clean drinking water necessitated the consumption of far more alcohol than many of us today would consider healthy. But given the choice, say, between a mug of ale or a Pilsner glass of cholera-infected water, I do believe every one of us would choose the ale every time. There's a tendency then, today, to call all sorts of historical figures alcoholics, despite the fact that the word and the concept behind it only came into being in 1852. Today we can read that Mozart was an alcoholic, Beethoven was an alcoholic, Schubert was an alcoholic, Liszt, Schumann, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, etc., all alcoholics. Please. Drinkers? Yes, they were. But we must and will be careful about who we call an alcoholic, especially if they lived at a time when alcoholic beverages were among the only safe ways to consume fluid. Drinks of choice. Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750. Sebastian Bach was, when it came to drink, omnivorous. He'd happily consume whatever was at hand, and in significant amounts. For example, he was a guest of the city and churches of Halle between September 1st or so and December 15th, 1715, there to act as an advisor/consultant on a major church organ construction project. The locals put him up at the city's best hotel, the Inn of the Golden Ring, and covered all of his expenses. The itemized hotel bill sent by the innkeeper, J. H. Eberhardt, to the Halle Church Board for reimbursement included the following line items, quote, for beer, 18 Groschen, for brandy, 8 Groschen, unquote. The eminent Bach scholar and Bach biographer Christoph Wolff tells us that, quote, 18 Groschen would buy 32 quarts of beer, that's 8 gallons, at retail price, unquote. Given that Bach spent 2 weeks in Halle, that comes out to 73 ounces of beer per day. A standard six-pack consists of 72 ounces of beer. So there it is. Bach was consuming a six-pack of suds per day plus brandy. Speaking of brandy, Christoph Wolff goes on to tell us that, quote, when Bach retreated into the solitude of his composing studio all by himself, he apparently preferred to do so with a bottle of brandy, unquote. Beer and brandy aside, when push came to shove, Bach's drink of first choice was wine. He often stipulated that his services be paid for in wine rather than cash. We read that he preferred wines from the Rhine Valley. Given that the wine industry on the western side of the valley had been devastated by both the 30 Years' War and campaigns of expansion conducted during the reign of the French king Louis XIV, the wines Bach drank almost certainly came from the area on the eastern bank of the Rhine. According to the wine writer Antonio Capurso, quote, it's likely he drank Riesling from Rheingau and Spätburgunder, that's Pinot Noir, from Baden, unquote. Well, okay then. Now we all know what to bring as a host gift when we're invited to dine with Sebastian Bach. Wolfgang Mozart, 1756 to 1791. Mozart, having spent much of his childhood and adolescence in the company of the rich and famous, developed expensive tastes in clothes, wigs, and booze. He liked beer and wine, but preferred champagne at a time when champagne was extremely expensive. But even more, his drink of choice was punch. We must dispel all of our preconceived ideas about punch, be it Hawaiian or some frat house concoction intended to inebriate and render pliable unsuspecting co-eds. In Mozart's day, punch was a generic term for a wide variety of cocktails that combined all sorts of spirits with citrus juices and spices of various kinds. Successful punch recipes were kept secret and within families for generations. Parenthetically, one of the most famous anecdotes to come down to us from Joseph Haydn's first visit to England is about punch. He arrived in London on January 2nd, 1791. Less than 3 weeks later, he attended a ball given in honor of the birthday of Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III. It was there, at the ball, that Haydn, to the amazement of the bewigged throng, was greeted by the Prince of Wales himself, even though Haydn had not yet been formally presented at court. I mean, have you ever? Haydn was quite taken with the prince, the future King George IV, as the prince was quite taken with Haydn. But what Haydn was particularly taken with was the punch served by his royal hosts. The royal tender of the bar was instructed to share the punch recipe with Haydn, who carefully wrote it into his diary as being the Prince of Wales's own punch recipe. Quote, 1 bottle champagne, 1 bottle Burgundy, 1 bottle rum, 10 lemons, 2 oranges, 1.5 pounds of sugar, unquote. Back then to Mozart's own affection for punch and his likely punch recipe. According to the historian Robert Wynne, in a run-on sentence, the magnificence of which suggests he was drinking the very fluid he describes, quote, Mozart would have favored a punch recipe of contemporary English origin whose high alcohol content from whiskey and or rum was subordinate to a fragrant balance of edgy citrus and arak, a liquor made from fermented sap of coconut flowers or sugarcane, tartness floating over a mildly sweet, fruity background, diluted or rather carried aloft, with German sect, sparkling wine, and green tea, leaving the mouth with a pungent aftertaste without bitterness, thereby inviting further libation without buckling knees and contrite submission, providing rather a destabilizing strong push rather than a walloping kick, an invitation to sip with caution rather than swallow with abandon, unquote. Whatever else it contained, Mozart's punch would also have contained sugar, a lot of sugar, which was a most expensive commodity at the time. It was just such punch that Mozart famously imbibed on the night of October 28th to 29th, 1787, while he feverishly composed, or more accurately, copied out from the mainframe that was his brain, the overture to his opera Don Giovanni, which received its premiere later that day. Ludwig van Beethoven, 1770 to 1827. Sadly, alcohol did Beethoven in. Among the many things, none of them good, that Beethoven's autopsy revealed was that his liver, which was leathery in consistency, with a bumpy surface, greenish-blue, and containing pea-sized nodules, was shrunk to half of its normal size. His spleen and pancreas were both swollen to twice their normal size and black in color. It is almost certain, I wrote almost merely to cover myself, that Beethoven died of progressive liver disease and finally decompensated, that is, accompanied by bleeding, abdominal fluid, and jaundice, cirrhosis. His immediate cause of death was a hepatic coma, meaning total liver failure. As for the cause of Beethoven's liver disease itself, we need look no further than genetics and the bottle. His paternal grandmother, Maria Josefa, was a chronic alcoholic who was shut away in a convent in Cologne for the last 20 years of her life by her husband, Beethoven's paternal grandfather. Beethoven's father, Johann, was a notorious drunk as well. He died at the age of 52. Beethoven himself drank what is described in the literature as, quote, vast, unquote, amounts of wine, beer, and brandy, usually starting before noon. If he was indeed an alcoholic, as previously observed, the term itself wasn't invented until 1852, 25 years after Beethoven's death. Then he was a high-functioning alcoholic, and like Vincent van Gogh, Winston Churchill, Ernest Hemingway, W.C. Fields, among many others, Beethoven's propensity for drink did not apparently impede his creative activity and may, in fact, have actually enhanced it. But along with his intake of alcohol, Beethoven had a genetic predisposition towards liver disease, and it got him in the end. He often imbibed at a well-known inn/watering hole in Vienna called Zum Weißen Schwan, to the White Swan. Sadly, the inn was demolished in 1847. In a letter to his friend, Nicholas Zmeskal, 1759 to 1833, Beethoven wrote, quote, "Let us meet at 7 this evening and drink more of their disgusting red wine," unquote. Now, that disgusting red wine was likely local hooch from around the foothill called Kahlenberg Mountain, which lies just north of Vienna at the eastern edge of the Vienna woods. Beethoven's taste for such cheap red wine did not help his health one bit. He had a particular taste for fortified wine, which is wine to which a distilled spirit, most typically brandy, has been added. Beethoven preferred sweet, cheap wine fortified with lead acetate, lead sugar, which is an inexpensive, sweet-tasting additive that's easily soluble in water. By the way, for reasons I cannot fathom, the lead found in Beethoven's hair at the time of his death is back in the news and is once again being credited for his deafness, his gastric problems, and his psychological issues. I will, as I have already been doing for 20-plus years, happily debunk this ongoing red herring at my soonest convenience. At the very end of his life, lying in his deathbed, Beethoven's thoughts turned to his Rhineland hometown of Bonn and his regret at never seeing the Rhineland again. Desperate for at least a taste of his youth, he requested that the Mainz-based publishing house of Schott send him a bottle or two of local Rhine wine. That gift of Rhine wine, a case of 1806 Rudesheimer Berg Riesling, arrived on March 24, 1827. The bottles were brought to Beethoven's bedside, and he whispered, quote, "Pity, pity, too late," unquote. These were almost certainly his last words. A few hours later, he fell into a coma and died 2 days later, on March 26th. Johannes Brahms, 1833 to 1897. You want to talk about following in the footsteps of the master? Johannes Brahms's favorite wine was the same Rudesheimer Berg Riesling from the Rhine Valley that was delivered to Beethoven's bedside 2 days before his death. However, unlike Beethoven, Brahms did manage a sip before uttering his last words. Just before he passed away, on April 3, 1897, Brahms managed to lift a glass of that Rudesheimer Berg Riesling to his lips and take the tiniest of sips. His last words, quote, "That tastes nice," unquote. In tomorrow's Dr. Bob Prescribes post, we're going to pick up directly from here as we continue to explore the drinking habits, both good and bad, of Franz Schubert, Gioacchino Rossini, Franz Liszt, Richard Wagner, Modest Mussorgsky, Antonin Dvorak, Jean Sibelius, Alexander Glazunov, and Igor Stravinsky. From there, it will be on to famous drinking songs from the repertoire, which we will hear and, in all cases but one, watch on video as well. Until then, thank you. To sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses / The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.